So good to have everybody here on this April 7th, 2023 for our College Autism Network Virtual Association of Scholars or Canvas meeting. I'm Brett Nachman, your host, alongside our Executive Director, Lee Williams, and our featured presenter for today, Dr. Kathy Szechy. So we'll get to Kathy's presentation in just a little bit, but we want to start off with our icebreaker. So we're going to encourage you to throw in some items in the chat or verbally speak up. And your prompt for today is, what is your favorite spring-related activity? So what might that be? And I misspelled related. Spring-related activity. Let's see some of your contributions. So we have Mary indicating gardening, to which Lee agrees. John likes staying in the garden for yard work. Tom is into hiking. Sarah loves the bird singing. Yes, me too. Kimberly is up for reading outside and gardening. Same with Amy, loving the gardening. Baseball for John. First bike ride of the season. Swimming. Going to the desert. Sitting out on the porch by the fire pit. Oh, lots of good activities here. I'm sensing a theme without being outside for the most part. Of course. Closer to summer. Oh, tiny tree frogs. Now that's an interesting selection. I love that one. Yeah, lots of good fun activities in store for folks. Well, feel free to keep those coming. We're going to just share some general things with CAN. Most of you, not all of you, but I believe the vast majority of you have been part of our Canvas meetings in the past, so you know that you hear about these meetings through being on our listserv. We encourage you to stay apprised of our upcoming meetings, as well as recordings of our meetings as well, in case you can't make one of them live. We encourage you, if you have the means, to become an official CAN member, which affords certain benefits, including discounts for our College Autism Summit, which leads into our executive director, Lee, to talk a little bit about some important summit-related news.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Hi, everyone. So this summit, summit number 7, which is kind of amazing when for those of us who have been there for all 7 of them, time flies. But the call for programs and the call for registration is just opened. I will drop the link right there in the chat so you can take a look at the website for all the details. We're really excited about our theme this year, which is finding a balance, something that we can all aspire to. Call for programs for both research presentations, but also practitioners' efforts will be greatly appreciated. And the deadline is, I don't know, I think June 1st or 5th, something in there. So get them in soon. We'll be in Nashville, Tennessee, October 18th to 20th. And we look forward to seeing many of you there. And I think the other thing that I wanted to mention that CAN is working on is if you're aware of somebody that is starting a new autism initiative or program on campus and wants to get off to a good start, the College Autism Network is sponsoring a 3-part webinar series led by Lori Ackles from Rochester Institute of Technology and Jane Thurfield Brown from the College Autism Spectrum in June, week of June 5th. And it's a 3-part series on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, with a year of follow-up mentoring for people who are launching new programs. You can also find out about that on our website and encourage you to share that information with any colleagues who might be charged with starting a new program and don't know where to begin. Here's the answer. That's all I've got, Brett. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee. Always a lot of programming here at CAN. And from here, want to put it out to all of you. What are some news items or celebrations or other pieces of information that you want to share with the CAN community? This is the great time to do it before we shift into our presentation. Feel free to turn on your microphone or enter in the chat as you'd like. See, I think people are already daydreaming about the spring activities that we're just gearing up for, I guess.
The little peepers, the little peeper frogs. That's where my mind went.
Or maybe Easter chocolate, which is where my mind went.
That kind of peep.
So I'll share two things of interest, at least I think to hopefully be of interest. One, on a personal note, this summer I'll be moving from Florida State University to Michigan State University. So, there's nothing that you all need to know about that, but that eventually my FSU email address and such will stop working. But as part of that, and one of the more happy things to report associated with that is that this project that you've heard me and Brett talk about consistently over the last year, the project Pieces, which we're hoping will become a publicly shareable, not publicly, but like external research, people shareable database, will get some funding support. We were just notified that we are going to get $500,000 from the Spencer Foundation for Education to get that project out of its pilot phase and set it up for the next 3 years. So if you hear from us in the next couple of months, please know that we're trying to make this thing work. We've got the infrastructure and support to do it from them, but that we rely on a lot of you all to help us make sure we're asking the right questions, getting good information, and reaching both the students and the other stakeholders that are really important to the work that you all are doing, and we want to be able to support that along the way. So keep an eye out for info from us and let us know if there's anything we can fill you in on about that project, but that's public now, so I thought we'd share.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, we're really excited and all about autistic college student success. So however folks define that, and our initial pilot data is absolutely fascinating. We had 430 participants, and that was quite huge in scale, and we certainly want to scale it up even further with the engagement of everybody here. So we can directly provide insights in how programming and structures can be redefined for autistic college students. Other news items that folks want to share or celebrations. I know this is the time of people getting ready to graduate, folks publishing articles, successes in your programs. What do folks want to share? Apparently that may have been a mic drop moment, Brad, because now nobody's saying anything, but I think folks are just a little bit quieter today, but that's quite all right. If there are any items you want to share with folks, feel free to do that in the chat. Yeah, sometimes there's some fluidity to that. But I do want to also encourage folks. There have been a bunch of different great conversations in the Canvas listserv that I encourage you all to check out. Resources being shared. There was a great conversation last week about with teaching and different resources along those lines. So lots of good stuff to be viewed at your own time. We're going to turn it over now to our featured presenter, who will probably have a little bit more time now. So Dr. Kathy Szechy just defended their dissertation at Wayne State University. Really exciting presentation today is on autism, adulthood, and employment challenges, the double empathy problem and perceptions of an autistic employee in the workplace. So we're going to turn our attention over to Kathy. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments, please put them in the chat. We'll allocate time toward the end for those questions to be addressed in real time. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Brett. Let me, we know this worked before, so let me share. All right. I'll assume if you don't tell me otherwise that it's good and you can see and hear. Okay. Thank you so much for having me present today. Again, after what Brett said, this is my dissertation data that I am sharing with you. I just want to say that throughout this presentation, I am going to use identity first language to honor the preferences of many autistic adults, but I do want to acknowledge and respect all language preferences that can change per person and over time. I know that in this space that there are parts of my presentation I've done that I can just skip, really. So like explaining high unemployment among autistic adults. I know that this audience is very aware of that. I will also skip the list of different ways autistic adults have reported struggling to function in non-autistic workspaces. So what I will just point out that of the many factors that have been associated with employment challenges for autistic adults, socially functioning in the non-autistic world of work is a significant factor that's been identified. And there are two theories of autistic social function I'm going to talk about today. They're not the only theories, like monotropism, for example, would be another. But the two I'm going to focus on is the longstanding theory of mind, deficits explanation, and the newer theory of the double empathy problem. And so also with this audience, I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail on theory of mind deficits explanation, although I can do that. But I think in the interest of time, I'm going to assume some familiarity with this as well. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Simon Baron-Cohen and also autistic adults who have objected to this explanation. So what I will do is talk about the critique of the theory of mind deficits viewpoint that has arisen. So this list is really just some of the critique questioning the theory of mind deficits explanation. One of the biggest criticisms is that there's this lack of connection between theory of mind abilities as they are traditionally assessed and the real world ways that autistic people struggle in the non-autistic social world. There's also, of course, the big myth about autistic people lacking empathy, which is a very large myth. For a very comprehensive analysis on this, Gernsbacher and Yergu have an excellent 2019 article. If you haven't seen it, that really breaks down a lot of the issues with theory of mind research. This is just a quick example of one way that theory of mind has been measured. Francesca Happe developed this method of having a person read a story about a character experiencing something and then answering questions about what's behind the character's behavior. And I'm mentioning this because this is related to my dissertation methodology as well. With Happe's strange stories, participants answer questions about what was happening, and then they're scored, a 2 for accurate theory of mind, 1 for partial, 0 for incorrect answer. But it's also very much typical of a lot of theory of mind assessment. So not all of her stories are about this one aspect of the theory of mind literature, but many are about this ability to detect pretense or lying, which autistic people are less likely to do. And therefore you're focusing on something that's already biased against the way autistic people socialize. And autistic people often report non-autistic people, telling them they're too blunt or too honest, which is again, very much from a non-autistic perspective. But Damian Milton, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, and others would say that because autistic people are the minority, then the non-autistic majority kind of holds the power to determine what is the norm that then autistic people have to live up to. So autistic adults, and in particular self-advocates and academics and researchers, they've objected to this theory of mind deficits explanation. And it was Dr. Damian Milton, who's at the University of Kent, who's autistic himself, who about 10 years ago proposed that autistic adult social skills challenges are from the double empathy problem. And again, many of you may be familiar with this theory as well, but I will briefly explain for those who may not be. So what autistic adults are basically saying is this, yes, we don't get you, non-autistic people, but you don't really get us either. And meanwhile, we understand each other well, we communicate well, and we're very comfortable with each other as well. So rather than the problem being in autistic impairments, the problem lies in the interaction between two neurologically different ways of being and socializing in the world. So the double empathy problem really shifts the responsibility for autistic social difficulties away from a deficit model and onto this empathic misunderstanding within the autistic and non-autistic social interaction. And there is emerging evidence for the double empathy problem. You know, there's still a lot to learn, but so far the evidence kind of falls into two camps. So one camp is demonstrating that non-autistic people don't understand autistic people, even though they often assume that they do. And then the other camp is that autistic people understand and are comfortable with and communicate well with each other. And so this is just a sample of a few studies that are from each of those areas. So what's missing here in theory of mind research? Well, because autistic people are the neurological minority, again, it's the non-autistic way of behaving and socializing that's held up as the norm. And as I mentioned before, a lot of that is about detecting pretense or lying, which is not salient to autistic people. Damian Milton would call that a mismatch of salience, as his book is called. So how about assessing how well someone interprets the behavior of another and infers mental states, which is part of theory of mind abilities, rather than focusing on pretense and lying? And theory of mind tests have been about testing understanding of non-autistic behavior. What happens when we ask people to read autistic behavior, and how does this relate to evidence for the double empathy problem? So with regard to employment difficulties for autistic adults, are the social problems of autistic people about theory of mind deficits or about the double empathy problem? And in looking at that, we should compare how both understand an autistic employee at work, which then has implications for how we view the problem and how we intervene to help. And that was really the purpose of my dissertation, which was to compare the historically dominant theory of mind explanation for autistic social challenges with that newer theory of the double empathy problem, but within the context of the workplace, which I don't know has been looked at. You know, you never can know about all of what's going on out there, but I haven't seen studies like that so far. If you have, please, I would be very interested to hear about them. So here are some other variables to also consider that might be associated with how well an autistic employee is understood. Particularly with non-autistic people, there may be a lot of variation in how well they understand autistic people. And there are past studies that have looked at autism knowledge. And while they've been less about understanding autistic people, there are associations between autism knowledge and more positive attitudes. And likewise, there are studies that have looked at experience with autism being associated with more acceptance and support. Although there's less compelling evidence for the connection with experience and attitudes, there's some evidence in the literature. So in terms of attitudes in the workplace, there's some prior work indicating that with disabilities in general, based on a person's belief about the disability and their experience with the disability, they form both attitudes about the person's competency on the job and their tendency to include them or avoid them socially at work, both of which can have implications for the quality of a person's work life and their success in employment. So how was the study run? So this was an online anonymous survey. I ended up with about 1/3 autistic participants and 2/3 non-autistic, with a decent enough sample size to do some analysis, which was good. All participants then read a story about a hypothetical autistic employee, but randomly would either read about a male or a female employee. I named them John or Julie. And then following reading the story, they answered several questions that measured the variables in the study. So the key to the study was really creating the story. And, you know, to do so, I started with pulling together material from several sources of autistic adult self-report difficulties in the workplace, you know, books by autistic authors on their experience, recorded interviews, blog posts. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network material was really helpful here, conference material on employment experiences, studies of qualitative interview data as well that describe the lived experience of autistic adults in the workplace. And I do really want to pause here for a moment, and I just want to acknowledge the wonderful support I received from Canvas. There were several autism researchers who are part of this group who reviewed and gave feedback on this measure. And so as a result, there were several drafts to try to get it as true to the lived experience of a hypothetical autistic employee as possible. I won't take the time to show the story right now in the interest of time, but I have it if anyone's interested. But basically, it starts with an autistic employee who, over the course of the day, due to several experiences, becomes overwhelmed and has like an autistic meltdown experience in which his or her brain just kind of shuts down and they're just unable to respond or process. And then following the story, there were several open-ended questions asking or sort of getting at participants' understanding of what's going on with the autistic employee's behavior. And the scoring methodology was very similar to that of hat-based strange stories. To get a score of 2, you really needed to understand both of the important components: that John or Julie was overwhelmed, that they were shut down, they were incapable of answering a supervisor's question. So the big picture with scoring was really, how do we make sense of this person's behavior? And at the same time, paying attention to what is incorrectly assumed about this person. So in the interest of time, I won't go through the complex scoring system, but I'm happy to share it. It was complex. All scoring was done by 2 scorers that were blind to the neurotype of participants and all other data. And then, of course, there was inter-rater reliability calculated. But despite that, discrepancies were still discussed and reconciled between raters. Here are the other measures used in the study, which I'm just going to go over briefly. But in addition to the self-reported autism diagnosis, I asked participants to complete the RITFO Autism and Asperger's Diagnostic Measure, which was recommended by members of Canvas. Again, thank you so much to people for their help with this. Also, the wonderful Dr. Kristen Gillespie-Lynch sent me the participatory autism knowledge measure that she and her team developed from the original autism knowledge scale. And I did use 2 scales from previous publications I have with my advisor, the social acceptability and competency suitability at work scales. And as you can see, I did a lot of the typical psychometric analysis on the scales. And here are the autism experience questions that I factored into my regression analysis. There are a lot more elegant ways to measure autism experience I kind of figured out later. So good for the next study to do a better job of measuring autism experience. Here's the sample by neurotype, and I'm just showing you this because I wanted to point out a couple of important things about the sample. I did have significantly more autistic participants identify as non-binary, gender non-conforming, transgender, or other, which is consistent with the literature, and also statistically did allow for that 3rd gender category to be entered into the regression models, which was good. My autistic sample was also slightly younger, fewer college and advanced degrees, and less time employed in adulthood, of course. But also importantly, that RAD's measure of autistic traits, where higher scores mean more autistic traits, is distinguishing very nicely between the 2 groups. So, the mean of 9.6 for non-autistic, mean of 23.8 for autistic, which is again very much consistent with the literature. So let's talk about the all-important central hypothesis, right? So to illustrate this, I have a flow chart, and this approach to hypothesizing is consistent with what you see in the double empathy problem literature. So basically, if the participant is autistic and correctly interprets the behavior, then this is evidence for the double empathy problem, because the double empathy problem would say that autistic people understand each other. And if they do not, then that's really contributing evidence for theory of mind deficits, as autistic people are thought to have impaired theory of mind. If the participant was non-autistic, then the opposite's true. So given that non-autistic people are supposed to have superior theory of mind, they should understand the behavior accurately. But if they don't, this really supports the double empathy problem, which would say that non-autistic people mistakenly think they understand autistic when they don't. And well, here are the results. So as you can see, close to the same proportion of autistic and non-autistic participants scored as 0 or inaccurate, but significantly fewer scored a 1, and a significantly greater number of autistic participants scored a 2, which means they accurately interpreted the behavior of the autistic employee compared to non-autistic participants. So these results really do support the double empathy problem. But here was a surprising finding I didn't expect to find, right? So, remember again that RAD's measure of autism traits, the higher scores mean greater number of self-reported autistic traits. So you can see from the box plots, those center lines are means that show the average RAD scores. That, or the autistic group who scored a 1 or a 2 had significantly higher RAD scores or reported more autistic traits. And the opposite was true of the non-autistic group. So those that scored the poorest on behavior interpretation towards the autistic employee also reported higher average autistic traits. It was not a finding I expected to have, but it's very much as though the very things that make it difficult for an autistic person to function in the non-autistic world are of benefit in the autistic world. I'm going to talk about that again in a minute, but here's just a summary of the main findings. So the autistic participants were more likely to accurately understand the behavior of the autistic employee in the story. But one of the things to consider again about that RADS measure of autistic traits, it's partially about how well someone functions socially in the non-autistic world. It has this mentalizing subscale, which is a lot of the items. And when you look at it, that's really what it's about. So what this finding suggests is that if you're autistic and you struggle more to function in the non-autistic world, you may be socially more adept in the autistic world. So again, support for the double empathy problem, and that problems in the interaction between autistic and non-autistic persons, is a clash of neurologically different social cultures. And that's what Damian Milton basically says. All right, so let's look further. So in looking at what role to play autism knowledge and experience have, I looked at their association with the behavior interpretation scores, but also how they may differ by neurotype. So basically, this is showing which variables were significantly associated with scoring a 2 or accurate behavior interpretation. There were other variables in the model, including race, but again, in the interest of time, I'm just showing you the significant ones. In that first model, without the autism knowledge measure in it yet, being autistic, and we already knew that, education level, being a cisgender woman, or being in that third gender category were all significant predictors of accurate behavior interpretation of the autistic employee. However, the one significant autism variable, those that indicated autism was the focus of their work or study, they were significantly less likely to have accurate behavior interpretation towards the employee in the vignette. However, adding in autism knowledge significantly changed the picture. So we can see that autism knowledge is a very influential predictor, and only being autistic is still the significant predictor left. So if you study or work in the field of autism, and or you're a service provider, the importance of being educated with accurate autism information, I think, can't be overstated. But just as a side note, I did not add in here that the interactions with neurotype and knowledge and experience, because they were not significant. So even for autistic participants, having greater knowledge of autism was associated with better behavior interpretation towards the autistic employee. So then I looked at predictors of the attitude scales, and I'll start with the competency and suitability scale. And apologies for all the information here, but I'll break it down for you. So if you look at the first model, it does turn out that having a behavior interpretation score of 2 or accurately interpreting the behavior is predictive of more positive attitudes towards the employee's competency. So the better you read and understand the autistic behavior, the more you see the person as competent on the job. So likewise, having an autistic relative as a predictor, there was that inverse relationship, however, with having had an autistic coworker being associated with less positive attitudes, and that is of concern. But if you look at model 2, you can see that once again, autism knowledge is a powerful predictor of attitude scales and overrides some of the other relationships. So what gets interesting is when I added in the interaction. So there is a relationship between autism knowledge and attitudes towards the person's competency as an employee, but it depended on how well you understood the behavior. So what I did is I graphed that interaction so we can have a look at it. So this is the regression model with predicted values of that competency suitability scale scores. And when you look at that, you can see that those who scored a 2 on autism knowledge was really not that impactful of attitudes. So if you understood the behavior, autism knowledge didn't really impact your attitude much. But for those who scored a 0 or 1, there was a strong relationship between autism knowledge and more positive attitudes. So autism knowledge was especially important if the participant did not understand the behavior of the autistic employee. And these findings were regardless of whether or not the participant was autistic themselves. So let's look at the other attitude scale, social acceptability. And you can see again that accurate behavior interpretation towards the autistic employee in the story was associated with more positive attitudes towards them, along with having an autistic relative. However, once again, when you account for autism knowledge, the picture changes and it again becomes the most influential predictor. And in all of these models, there was a very significant increase in model fit. So when we added in autism knowledge. And then this time as well, there's that same finding where the relationship between autism knowledge and social acceptability attitudes also depends on behavior interpretation. And so does the relationship between neurotype and social acceptability. So we'll look at that. So I graphed it again and it looks the same, right? So first of all, you know, if you understand the behavior of the autistic employee, then autism knowledge doesn't really impact your social acceptability attitudes towards the person. But if you don't understand the behavior well, there's a strong association again between knowledge and more positive attitudes. So autism knowledge matters, but especially if you did not understand the behavior. Just regarding that finding with neurotype, when we graph that interaction, you can see that for the non-autistic group, the average attitude scale scores are relatively similar for those who did or did not understand or accurately interpret the behavior well. But for the autistic group, those that accurately interpreted the behavior, really understood what was happening with the autistic employee, had higher social acceptability scales compared to those that did not. So just wrapping up, what's associated with more positive attitudes? Well, regardless if we're talking about competency or social acceptability, greater autism knowledge in and of itself is a significant predictor, but this is especially the case if the participant did not understand the behavior. And then regarding social acceptability, the most positive ratings were autistic participants who also understood the behavior. Unfortunately, though, having a history of an autistic coworker was associated with less positive attitudes towards competency and suitability. And again, this is of concern, and I think highlights the importance of this issue of behavior being understood and autism knowledge. So let's pull it together with some conclusions. So what we're talking about here is really a paradigm shift away from focusing on that deficit model of autistic persons for what instead is a mutual misunderstanding on both sides. And, you know, remember the finding of the differences in the pattern of autism traits measure, where autistic traits were associated with improved understanding of autistic behavior of another if you were autistic yourself. It's leading us to consider that autistic people socialize and empathize very differently from non-autistic and in ways that work for them in the autistic community. And meanwhile, autistic people are basically blamed for what is a mutual problem between autistic and non-autistic. The study also demonstrates that poor understanding of autistic employees is associated with them being perceived as less competent and less socially accepted as a coworker. Being perceived as less competent and suitable for the job can have impacts on opportunities at work to progress and even jeopardize employment. Being perceived as less socially acceptable can mean being isolated and excluded, which can impact quality of work life. So there's a lot at stake here for autistic employees who are misunderstood. So far in the field of autism and employment, a lot of interventions, not all, but a lot are focused on having autistic people learn how to act and respond in specific situations. So although you may teach useful skills, and teaching skills is a good thing, we all need skills. I actually recently had to learn skills because I'm on the academic job market, but we teach them to fit one situation, and then they're really hard to generalize across the so many complicated and nuanced ways to interact in a non-autistic workplace. And autistic adults still have high unemployment rates. There was a really interesting study done by Bury et al. In 2021, where they interviewed autistic employees and their employers. If there were problematic social interactions in the workplace, it was up to the autistic employee to really be responsible for apologizing, to try to adjust, maybe avoid people to try to fix the problem. And in doing that, they really internalize negative beliefs about themselves and about their functioning. Where the double empathy problem points to is changing the workplace culture to accommodate autistic people by understanding first that this is a mutual problem where both sides are responsible for understanding each other. But it's also about being supportive and accepting of differences rather than trying to get autistic people to be non-autistic. And brief comment here and shout out to the masking literature, which tells us a lot about the consequences of autistic people trying to pass off as non-autistic, right? So how do we change workplace culture? Well, there's a lot of ways, but let's talk about autism education. So autism knowledge was, again, the very influential predictor of accurate behavior interpretation towards the autistic employee and towards attitudes towards that employee. They're very strong predictor of attitudes towards competency and social acceptability. So findings really support autism knowledge as a promising environmental support to increase both the understanding of autistic behaviors and challenges in the workplace and positive attitudes towards an autistic employee. So autism knowledge may overcome the double empathy problem, and also autism knowledge may overcome other factors that get in the way of autistic people being perceived as competent and as people to be socially included in the workplace. So I'm just going to leave you with this slide of final thoughts, including this great quote by Kerry Watts. If you've not heard her speech to the Scottish Parliament, I recommend it. It was just excellent. You can find it on YouTube, I think. And that's really my talk. So what questions or comments do you have?
That was fantastic, Kathy. Thank you so much. Let's turn it over to our Canvas community and see what is on their minds. You're welcome to verbally share your thoughts and questions or put them in the chat.
Just glancing at the chat here myself. You know what, I'll stop share maybe, although I'm happy to go back to anything that people want me to show.
Kathy, super quick, you don't happen to have those slides available in some public display place, do you? Because there was a lot of detailed information in there. You don't have them like on a Google Drive or Dropbox or anything?
I'm happy to
share.
provide them.
Okay.
I can just drop them into the Canvas listserv. I know there was a lot of detail and I was cognizant of the time, right? Like I flashed them by kind of quick so that you'd know they're there, but I wanted to be sure not to take too much time. So absolutely, I'll just share them out.
Cool. Thanks. I didn't mean to interrupt the questions. I was just wondering if you had it.
Kathy, it looks like there's a question from Mary, wondering if you could explain further what is involved as quote unquote autism knowledge and what types of items does that measure ask?
You know what I'll do is I'll show you the measure. I do have hidden slides in my presentation. That again, I didn't want to sorry, I gotta manage it. There we go. Here's all my hidden slides. So I saved you from all this detail. Let me see if I can find it. There it is. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
I mean, the thing about the participatory autism knowledge measure, which I think is important, is that, first of all, this is a lot of just basic autism knowledge, but my understanding, and Dr. Gillespie Lynch could speak to this much, much better because this came from her team, is that it was also developed, co-created by autistic collaborators. So this is, I think, another important point is that this is information that autistic people thought was important for people to know. Yeah. And it addresses some myths. It addresses some sort of typical autistic traits. It's not even employment specific, right? It's just basic information about autism.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that visual, Kathy. It looks like Summer has a question next.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, hi Kathy. This was also, I thought, a really informative, illuminating presentation. I think you mentioned at one point early on that you were able to share the vignette that you used. You said you had several drafts of it. I assume that's either in the appendix or maybe somewhere else. How would I get access to that?
I will include it in my slides. I can show it to
Okay,
you.
perfect.
It's one of those hidden slides.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I will absolutely include it. I'll make a note of that. Make sure, copy the vignette. The other thing that's really important is the scoring system, because the whole study really hinged on that. Like if the vignette wasn't a good lived experience, and if the scoring system wasn't accurate, then the findings are not so useful.
I'm following up on that. I just wondered if there had been any discussion at all in the role that ADHD, other undiagnosed or diagnosed, may play in this as well. I don't know from experience because I don't have ADHD, but I have understood that that is a lot harder to mask in an employment situation than autism, or maybe they're together on the same spectrum. I'm not sure. That was just something I was curious about when you were drafting those vignettes, if that had come up at all.
It hasn't, but that's an excellent point. ADHD and the kinds of struggles people have with ADHD in the workplace would definitely be important variables to look at. So if you want, I haven't had a chance to look through the chat. Do you want me to look and see what's there?
Several people really enjoying your presentation, so you can enjoy the kudos.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's yeah, it's typical, right? When you do this kind of work and then right after you go, oh, next time I want to do it this way. Next time I want to do this way. I could then go on for a while about all the things I'd like to do differently next time and ways I want to continue to do this work. Lee was asking, are there particular autistic traits that stand out as being higher priority for non-autistics to understand? I think where the vignette was concerned, what happened a lot is people either didn't understand that the person was overwhelmed, or they didn't understand that, and maybe I'll just show it to you and then you can have a look. They didn't understand that the idea that with autistic people, when they become completely overwhelmed, that they can't process. And the vignette ends with the supervisor asking the person what's wrong and the person can't answer. And I think what was really important for non-autistic people to understand is that that's an involuntary situation. This is not a matter of being defiant or difficult or choosing not to answer. And I think, in talking about the classic theory of mind measure being understanding pretense or lying or manipulation. What's important in terms of understanding autistic people in this situation is that there's a lack of that going on. And there was assumptions that some people made that this person was, for purposely being difficult, which is not accurate. So that would certainly be a big priority, I think. I think the other thing that was challenging is understanding how stressful the non-autistic workplace can be. And there's several people and there's a lot of literature from autistic adults talking about what helps them in terms of accommodations and support in the workplace so that workplaces are not overwhelming. And when I wrote the vignette, I tried very much to have the workplace be very much typical. I wasn't trying to make it extra stressful, but typical of what a workplace, it was a fictional manufacturing company, of what that can be like. But the autistic response to those kinds of stressors, understanding that and understanding why that's difficult, because this is a different way of being in the world and a different way of socializing and handling things like ambiguity and such. Let me there's the scoring system, which is very complicated, but if you want to take a minute to read the story, I can put it there while I answer other questions. There were other, like, since this was written, it's typical of work as well. I've thought, oh, there's a couple of things I should have done differently when I did the different genders. But that's, yeah, that's life and research. Things you wish you'd done differently.
I had a quick comment and question. A colleague and I recently, a company reached out to us because they found that we previously in the past had done social skills work with peers, with the peers program, and they reached out to us saying that, you know, we've got some folks here that are struggling with social skills, and basically they wanted us to come in and help improve their social skills. And when we came in to help with that, we met with their HR, and it turned out they just have a whole bunch of processes there that are not friendly really for anybody. And so I think what we found is navigating how to, if you're researchers or people from outside that organization, how do you come in and say, well, you know, it's not just the people on the spectrum that are struggling, it's everyone is having an issue here. Like one example was they have meetings without agendas sometimes, or people will talk for 30 minutes when they're supposed to talk for 5 minutes, and then people can't get their word in or their comment. And so we had a bunch of examples of vignettes from them because they did a company-wide survey. And I actually have a poster on this that if anybody's going to be at INSAR, I'm sharing some of our work on that. But I think just a question about how do you navigate if a company maybe has identified that's an issue or a workplace, but then you come in and you say, well, actually what you think is the problem isn't quite the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, any comments on that?
It's a tricky one, right? Because they have what they think is going to make the situation better, and you go in and you see that things are actually really different. I'm thinking about my colleagues in higher ed and many of the people on this call, and a similar idea around universal design. Seems like there's a parallel there with that. You know, the idea about universal design is that the kinds of things that you do to change higher education to accommodate autistic people or benefit to everybody, and help education be more accessible. So maybe that's the approach. I don't know about coming in and saying, we can do this thing that you brought us in to do, but we might be able to benefit everybody if we have a look at those things that are a barrier to functioning, not just for autistic people, but for a lot of your people.
Yeah, that's exactly actually where our minds went first. We introduced universal design to them. We talked about, we introduced the concept of concrete communication for everybody. And so that seemed to
Nice.
Be a way to go. But this was I think we were just lucky that this was a particularly receptive group. So I think we were wondering, oh man, if this was maybe a different environment of people we were working with. But yeah, we thought along the same lines.
I would just say as well that, you know, again, there's a lot of variables I didn't collect in this study that would have been really good. But the one, of course, again, that was so influential was autism knowledge. And to my way of thinking, this is not a very difficult thing to implement, to just provide education programs to workplaces about what autistic employees struggle with, what autism is about. Yeah, you know, it doesn't seem to me to be a really challenging support to put into place. Just my opinion. Oh, Dr. Gillespie Lynch is here. Yay. So we're trying to improve the PAC-M at the moment. If anyone is interested in helping improve it and would be able to recruit so we could assess it in different cultural contexts, please reach out to me. That would be awesome. One of the things I would like to do, and I think we've talked about this before, you and I, Dr. Gillespie Lynch, when we exchanged email, is that what I didn't have the sample size to do, but I would really like to do is something called invariance testing. And some of you may be familiar with that kind of psychometric analysis, but basically what you're doing is looking at, do these items on this questionnaire have the same meaning, particularly between autistic and non-autistic groups, but also other cultural groups as well. So yeah.
Kathy, it looks like we have a question from Lauren, wondering if you assessed participants' levels of empathy and emotional intelligence.
No, those have been excellent variables to include for sure. One of the things that is missing from the study as well is just looking at verbal intelligence, because there's been a lot of talk about theory of mind assessment really just being assessing people's verbal ability, verbal IQ, which I didn't, collect that data. However, I would like to point out that the autistic participants in my study were more likely to accurately interpret the behavior, but the sample of my autistic participants had fewer higher education degrees and were a little younger as well. So no, I didn't assess the IQ, and I didn't assess verbal IQ in particular, or emotional intelligence, but I thought that was interesting part of the sample, and yet they still did better on the behavior interpretation measure.
Interesting. Kathy, looks like we have a question from Brad next.
Go ahead, sorry. I stopped sharing because I thought it's easier to converse, but if anybody wants the story back up, I'll put it back up. I had it there for a bit so people could look at it.
So the reason I asked you earlier about the slides is that there was one in particular, like halfway through, that caught my attention. But if I remember correctly, one of your findings on the initial regressions was that those who worked with, or whose work was focused on, I guess is probably the language you use, whose work focused on autism were significantly less likely to score well on the interpretation of the. Am I remembering that right? Yeah.
Now the way the question was phrased was in the questionnaire is autism the focus of your work or study? Yes or no? So okay. This is again one of those in retrospect methodological decisions where you went, oh, we could have done a better job of measuring that variable. So it's not well measured, but that is a finding of concern for sure.
I was gonna say, like, that's a lot of us, right? Literally us on this call, which strikes me. But you said also that that effect essentially went away when you included the variable reflecting autism knowledge. And so I guess that makes me wonder why that disconnect may happen. Yeah. So the autism, the odds ratio of 0.37. I mean, that's a meaningfully large reduction in predictive negative effect there. So I guess, can you speculate a little bit as to why you think that might be the case? What may be happening there? I've got my own very cynical idea, but I would like to think that there's something other than us as a group collectively thinking we know things that we don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to be cynical either, but my mind goes there too. On the upside, you can see how much autism knowledge matters. It's hard to know for sure. One of the things about the sample is, so my life has been that I've been in social work practice for a long time prior to coming back to the PhD program in the School of Social Work. And I even spent 10 years in K-12 education, special ed social work. So I've worked with a lot of autistic children, adolescents, adults. I also have a lot of people in my sphere who work in the field, or at least work in special education or work in education. And typical of graduate students doing a dissertation, I just kind of posted on social media, hey, take my survey. So I probably have a higher percentage of people in my sample that have exposure to autism or autistic people. So in thinking about that, some of them I know who work in the field do need more education and more understanding. Yeah, that's definitely the case. On the upside, what I will say is that just looking at the open-ended questions, some people maybe tried to overthink it. Because they're very knowledgeable or experienced, and maybe in the process of overthinking it, didn't get that all-important component to score a 2, which was to understand that this person is completely shut down and can't respond as a result of an autistic meltdown experience. That's my only thought. I could, and this is inspiring me to do this, I could poll that group and just pull all of their data and look at their open-ended questions more thoroughly to get a sense of that.
It was just one of those findings that caught my eye, caught my ear. And thank you for sharing more about it.
Yeah, appreciate you highlighting it because it's an important finding to think about, for sure. Again, autism knowledge just took over and captured a lot of the variance, right, in these models.
A lot of further exploration to be done, Kathy, I think. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up because we are nearing the hour mark, but can everybody please share their thanks for your presentation? I think there's a lot that you can be able to unpack here. So I hope we see multiple publications from you on this front and further engagement in Canvas. This is truly exceptional. We're going to be glad to have all of you back here in just about a month. We are going to be having our May Canvas meeting, which focuses on looking at the whole student identities and the higher education accommodation process with our colleagues from the George Mason University. So that's Dr. Morgan Steinwell, Dr. Grace Francis, and Dr. Jody Duke. So we'll see you all back here on Friday, May 5th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for that. And in the meantime, we'll see you on the Canvas listserv. And we thank you again for your participation today. Thanks, everybody. Thank you again, Kathy.